Welcome to LabMinutes.com. In this video, we will look at how to configure Cisco ISE to support wired 802.1x with Windows machine authentication using PEAP. Since this is our first video to mention machine authentication, in case you guys are not familiar with it, the idea is to only allow Windows machine that's already part of the domain to access the network. And when you tie that to user authentication, you can make sure not only user has to be a valid user, but he or she needs to log in from an authorized machine, usually the company-owned laptop, and not, for example, from a personal computer to get full access to the network. So here's our lab setup. We still have a Cisco ISE running version 112 at the IP of 32.102. We have a domain controller at IP.32.40. And we have a switch 1 configured to support 802.1x. And we have two users, admin 1 and employee 1 that resides in AD, and both are by default a member of domain users. And these users we will use to log into two machines, or test machines that we have. One is a domain computer, and the other one is non-domain computer, and we want to make sure that these users can only access the network when they log in using their domain computer or a corporate-owned computer. Okay, so we'll be dealing with port 19 on the switch. So to show you the configuration, the port configuration of the switch real quick here, it's just a standard 802.1x, and you can, to find out the details of the switch and port configuration and the explanation, please refer back to one of our videos. For the switch and WAS9 controller recommended configuration for ISE. Okay, but here you can see it's just that 802.1x is enable, and we have a default ACLs to make sure that by default user has no access to the network. Now to get started on our configuration on ISE, first, since we're going to be using AD authentication first, let's make sure that we still have a good connection to our Active Directory infrastructure here. Okay, so I'm glad that we checked that. For somehow the ISE has lost connectivity to the domain, so we can basically go and do that quickly. Okay, now that we have successfully joined ISE back to the AD, now as it says it's connected, then we can go back and start configuration on the Authentication Policies. This time we're not going to be using, let's not use the default allow protocol, but we're just going to want to lock it down to PEAP and EAP TLS for our feature lab. So we need to go to Policy Elements, Conditions, and let's open that on a new tab. But for this video, we're just going to use PEAP. Let's see, Authentication. Actually, that would be Results. Allow protocol. And go ahead and add. Name is, let's call LM PEAP TLS, since we're going to be allowing both PEAP and TLS. We'll uncheck PAP, we'll uncheck MD5, we'll keep TLS, we'll keep PEAP. We do not want eFast, and let's prefer TLS since it's a more secure authentication. Okay, now that we have the allow protocol, let's go back here, and again we can just use, since we are dealing with something that's very similar to what ISE has already provided as a default rule for .1x, so we're going to duplicate above, and let's change this and call it LM wired .1x. You can use a default wired .1x, and for allow protocol we just created one for PEAP TLS, and we need to enable it to get the next line right here, and we want to use AD and then local. Again, something this has been configured in the previous video as far as the external identity or identity source sequence rather. So first check the AD and then local. Okay, and then we can save. Okay, next we can move on to Authorization Policies, and to configure that we need conditions and permissions. So let's say we want to use reusable policy elements condition. So we go to policy elements, conditions, and we'll be dealing with two separate type of authorization here. One is for machine authentication, the other one is for user authentication. So let's do the machine authentication first. So we'll go to authorization with the compound condition, and we can just duplicate again since we're doing wired 8.2.1x. Checkbox duplicate, and let's call it LM wired machine. Just use default description. You can see the rule has already have two attributes configured to match wired 802.1x type of authentication. One is radius type service type frame. The other one is NAS port type Ethernet. So as long as the radius request contains these two particular attributes, ISE will categorize this as the wired 802.1x. But on top of that, we want to make sure that we will be matching domain computers to make sure it's a machine authentication. So let's go add attribute value. And if we go to AD, external group, because we know that all of our company, for example, company-owned machines should be joined to the domain, so it should be part of the domain computer by default. So specify domain computers, submit. Yeah, domain computer, no users should be under domain computer anyways. So that should be sufficient. Next, we create one more for the user authentication. What we can do, we can, let's see, we just did wire machine. We duplicate from that. And instead of wire machine, let's call it wire user. We leave the first two attributes, but for the AD group, we're gonna condition based on user being a domain user, which basically should be all the user. I mean, obviously, if you want to restrict it to just a certain group of users, you can do that. Just create a new AD group and then assign users to that. So that, but for now, let's assume that we want to allow all the AD users to be able to authenticate 802.1x. And in addition to that, we want to condition based on the machine the user is logging in from is also authenticated. So to do that, you select network access, and there's a condition called was machine authenticated. So we are conditioning based on the success of the machine authentication. We have to make sure that that is specified is true. Okay, so when you deal with Windows login, there are two-step process, like I mentioned. There's machine authentication and user authentication. So machine authentication takes place at the login page, or where there's a computer first boot up, or when you log out from a current account. Basically at the login page, there's on the background, the machine will try to send credentials and authenticate using some form of user computer name. So at that point, we just want to make sure once the machine authenticated, we just want to grant enough access for the machine to perform, for the user to perform AD login and nothing more. So we're going to create a spatial downloadable ACL. So go policy elements and then results, authorization, downloadable ACL. We'll add it. And let's call it LM AD login. So this is to authorize a machine to only have enough access to perform AD authentication with this Kerberos or the whatever it's required to authenticate users. Again, just to make life easier, already have the ACL ready to go, so just going to copy and paste because we want to make sure there's no typo. We can double check. So first line, again, that's a standard DSCP, allow DSCP, allow DNS, and then we only want to allow the machine or the device to only talks to our domain controller at 32.40. Obviously in the production, if you want to get a little more granular as far as blocking it down to just the protocol that's required to perform AD authentication, then you might need to sniff out and the packets while the user is trying to lock in and see what protocols are used. It might be includes things like NetBIOS, Kerberos, LDAP, that kind of protocol. So, but for now, let's keep our ACL simple here. Just gonna allow everything that needs to talk to or that's going towards the RAD or the domain controller. So with that, we save. Now we go to authorization profile. So go add, because authorization profile is what gets tied to the authorization policies. Here we call it LM wired AD login. It will be access except, point to our spatial DACL, which is AD login. We'll go submit. Okay, now that we have that in place, we can create a authorization rule or policy. Insert the rule below. Let's call this one LM wired machine. So specifically it's just for the machine authentication. And instead of creating condition on the fly, we can refer it back to our policy elements that we created earlier. Compound condition, and it should be called LM, let's see, wired machine. And right here you can see the details. With that, assuming the conditions are met, you want to allow it to only have the access to the domain login. Okay, so that's done. Wired login. Now for the user, the actual user authentication, let's go ahead and duplicate below. Instead of wired, we're going to call it user. Instead of machine, call it user. And we're going to change that to wired user. And we're just going to say if the both machine and user authentication succeeds, we want to allow full access to the network. So that would be LM permit all. That's just IP any permit. Okay. So now we save. So that should be it as far as the authentication authorization policies. Next, we can start testing. And we already have a test machine right here, and this is a domain join machine. Let's call win7-test1. Before we log out to the login page, on the switch, let's do debug authn all, and then login console. Let's clear the screen. We no shut the port 19, so no shut. And now let's go and log off. Okay, while that's happening at the same time on our ISE here, we can go to our authentication activity page. Let's filter it to the last hour or so. Let's see. We're just trying to force machine authentication here, so let's give it a few minutes. Let's see what's the status on the port. Miss out interface. Looks like it's not doing .1x right now. Let's try. Let's see what else we can try here. We can try to let's go ahead and reboot the machine here. So restart. Let's give a few seconds here for our test machine to come back up. Okay, I was just going to monitor the activity here. It doesn't look like it's trying to do 802.1x, so again we need to log in and see if the network interface is enabled for that. Oh, there you go. Actually, it went all the way this time. Let me show you one more time, just slowly this time. Let's go ahead and lock out because I want to show you the two steps that I talked about. Lock off. Okay, now I'm locked off. It's right here. Okay, so you can see here's the machine authentication part of it that succeeded already, and it got the authorization profile LM wired AD login. At the same time, there's a lot going on here, so no login console. So we just passed the machine authentication, and the state that we're in right now is if you did command authent session port 19. You see the DACL call LMAD login that we specified just to allow the access for the machine to the user AD authentication has been pushed to the switch. They're now in the state of authorization success. And to look at the access list, have it right here, AD login, and allows communication to the domain controller. Okay, and if you look at the detail, authentication detail, see authentication succeeded, it hit the, it matched the wire AD login, or actually received the authorization profile for wire AD login, PEAP with MS-Chat v2 with the radius attributes, and it used the allow protocol that we created, LM PEAP TLS. It used the AD one for the identity stores, and it was able to see the machine was part of the domain, which is the machine is a member of the main computer right here. So external group. And based on that, if you look further down with all the steps, see match default rule got use AD1, authentication succeeded or passed. And down below it's also got the authorization profile, which is correct. Okay, so that's the machine authentication. Now we're going to go ahead and log in. Okay, so this is the user authentication part of it. And if you go to here, refresh, now that we see the user admin one came in, and it now receives the authorization profile of permit all. So if you go back to the switch and look at the status on the port, now the new DACL of permit all has been installed to the port. And the username changed as well. If you notice that before, the username was it was the machine name itself. So this is the format that the Windows machine sent to authenticate. Okay, and now it's been replaced by the user credential. Okay, so if you go back to the machine or the test PC that we have and tries to browse internet. Okay, so you see that we have internet access, so the Google page loads up just fine. And again, go back to and take a quick look at the detail. Okay, this time we got authorization profile of permit all. And y.1x it matched the wired user authorization rule, and it sees that the user is a member of domain user right here. And one thing I want to make a quick note for you is part of the authentication process, there's a line that said ISE has confirmed previous successful machine authentication. So ISE is smart enough to match the MAC address of the machine between the two type of authentication. First is the machine and the next is the user. They're trying to pair them up and realize that this user has gone through a machine authentication. So the machine is authorized, the user is also authorized, and that's how it permits the network access. Okay, now we're gonna try the machine that is not part of the domain right here. So this machine is Win7 non-corp, is not part of the domain, and we can try to log in using a local account first. Let's see if we see that MAC address on the port itself. So show authent session interface pass 19. It's just the one that succeeded. Let's make sure the network interface is enabled. Okay, so go back to adapter settings. Now it's disabled, so let's go ahead and enable that. So by default, when you do the 802.1x from wired, it would try to use the Windows login credential, which obviously is not gonna pass the authentication. But if user happens to it's smart enough to basically tell us not to use the login account automatically, you will see that popped up that we just missed. So we have to go through disable and enable one more time. Okay, now here should pop up. So it said additional information is needed. So let's say the user is bringing in a personal laptop and trying to authenticate using his valid AD credential. So it will be LabMinutes, and let's call admin1, and then Cisco. You see here it said Windows cannot connect to the network, and if we go back to our authentication page, you'll see here the user has attempted to log in with the account, and access has been denied. So let's take a look of why it's been denied. So to see that, you have to kind of scroll down to the bottom and see the user is valid because when it tries to authenticate, say right, authenticating against Active Directory, it has passed. But the reason why the user is not allowed onto the network, because it tells you right here, ISE has not been able to confirm the previous successful machine authentication for the user. So because the machine the user is trying to accessing it from hasn't been authenticated, ISE is not letting it on the network, which is exactly what we want. And if you look back on the switch port, and by the way, the auto-test machine is just a VM, a virtual machine, so that's why it show up on the same port. This one is the one that successfully authenticated. This is the one that is our personal or a non-domain machine. And you can see, since we have the port configured to support multi-auth, we are able to support multiple MAC addresses off the same physical port. And this is how the switch displayed to you, just two separate authentication session. Okay. So the last thing I want to show you regarding the machine authentication is if you go to Administration, External Identity Source, and go into Active Directory. It's under Advanced Settings. You can see here there's a couple of checkboxes that's related to machine authentication. So first, whether or not you want to allow machine authentication. And the second one is for the what they call machine access restriction. It's basically to allow ISE to correlate the two type of authentication, the user, the machine and the user, as far as trying to pair up the two authentication process. And right here with the aging time, it's just the time that you tell ISE to cache the success of the machine authentication. So let's say the user stay logged on for longer than what we have set here is 12 hours. Or actually, if the user were to leave the office, let's say, and did not return to the next morning, and 12 hours has passed, and the machine authentication cache has expired, and the user then somehow is trying to connect to the network while he is already logged into the Windows, the machine authentication would not happen, and the user would not be able to get onto the network because the machine authentication only happens at login. Okay, so that means the other thing that cache, or the other situation the cache might get clear is when you restart the node service. So just be mindful about that. Once the cache authentication, machine authentication cache has been clear, then any users on the network that's currently logged into the Windows already will lose the machine authentication information from ISE, and they might have issue getting back onto the network unless they're whether reboot or log off and force themselves to log back in to go through the machine authentication process again. Okay, so that wraps up our video on Cisco ISE wired 802.1x and machine authentication with PEAP. Thank you for watching LabMinutes.com, and I'll see you guys in the next video.